1 Corinthians 1 to 4. Well, let's take the time now to read the two books which we have written by Paul at about this time to the city of Corinth. And it's important that I say that we have, because we have evidence from both books, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that Paul wrote other letters, at least two other letters, which we don't have. So of the four letters that we know Paul wrote to this city, we have the second and the fourth. Thus, having lost the first and third, by default we call it 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We know that Paul had spent some time in Corinth during his second missionary journey, about a year and a half. He had come to know those people quite well. This is a city of great commerce and trade in the Mediterranean world. It's also a city, and you've probably heard this, known for its immorality. It was the first city to have gladiatorial contests, but also when it came to physical or sexuality issues, religious pilgrims came to this city from all across the world to visit the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and fertility and prostitution. Many came to see the great temple of Apollo, still stands today. And if one wanted to be healed, you'd visit the temple of Asclepius, the god of emotional, physical, and mental healing. This is just three temples of the many that we know were in Corinth. And all this leads to take a verse like 1 Corinthians 10:13 in its proper context. I'd like to jump ahead and read it now. No temptation has taken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And the next verse says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. The temptation of the Corinthian, I don't believe, was as well. Yes, it was toward the physical, but I think it was even much more toward the spiritual. Imagine walking among these temples and daily being tempted to worship these great gods that had such beauty associated with them. Meanwhile, your Jesus has no temple, no priests, no feasts, no sacrifices, and yet you're expected to be faithful to this God that has no physical presence in your city. That would have been hard to explain to your friends, and even more difficult to be faithful to. That's my understanding, my guess. Well, that's what 1 Corinthians is about. I would say in its larger picture, the 16 chapters we have in this book, humility and love in the face of temptation toward success, prosperity, getting along with your neighbors that are worshiping other gods that tend to answer their prayers. And here I have a God that is at base humble and wants me to be humble. 1:18, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For since in the wisdom of God the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached. Foolishness of talking about a Jesus, again, who is not physically present in that town, to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign, Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. The Corinthian correspondence was clearly occasional, much like Paul's letters, but Paul had lived closely among these people again, and here's why he says then in 3:2, he had come to know how these people were thinking. I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you are not able to receive it, and even now you are not able, for you are still fleshly. For where there is envy and strife and divisions among you, are you not fleshly and behaving like mere men? For when one says, I am of Paul, or another, I am of Apollos, are you not fleshly? So differences in wealth and social stratification and the social differences that were part of this community showed up in how Paul's teaching was being accepted. Paul was being faced with, I like Apollos better. Apollos was a famous preacher or teacher who the Corinthians had known. And some even were saying, well, I'm even of Jesus and not of Paul. So Paul had his challenges in this city. And by the way, we have no evidence that the crowd of this church, or that the number of Corinthian believers exceeded about 150. So again, it's not a large group, but certainly one that knew what it was to have sectarian differences. So Paul's call, and it's not unlike what the rest of the Bible would be like, but here's his desire in 3:18 and 19. Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. The only way to go forward in the Christian life, Paul will say, is to be humble and to walk in humility with your God. Remember, this is the story of the Old Testament too, Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And of course, that means to walk humbly with one's neighbor, if you're going to walk humbly with God. Well, one of my favorite passages in all the Bible, and again, this is so consistent with the story of the Bible, is in 4:1 through 4. Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and as stewards of the mysteries of God. Before I continue to read from chapter 4, the temptation of this time period, and we often don't take this into our to account in our biblical reading, but oration and public speaking was considered a great talent and something to be respected. And so the idea of preaching to a throng, a large group of people who will ooh and ah over your ability to not only be rhetorical, but to move an audience, whether it be in drama or comedy or whatever. That was a great ambition among people. And Paul faced that, no doubt. I'm sure whenever Paul spoke, and in chapter 2, he talks about being weak in front of them, Paul's or anyone's concern would be to be respected by those who listen to you. But listen to how Paul again describes the Christian journey that he's understood, that he's living through. Let a man consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. I'm a servant of Christ. What does that teach me? Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful, not successful. And what Paul had come to understand, and from everything we know about the Apostle Paul, he was consistent in not only saying this, but behaving this way, that he had learned that, again, that story of aman or pistis, faithfulness to Jesus, led in the same way coming back to the person who was faithful, was that's what Christ actually wanted. We are to be faithful to him and faithful to Yahweh, and in turn, what Christ expects from us is simple faithfulness, even on an individual basis. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I know of nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. Paul had given himself to the idea that even he wouldn't go home at night wondering how he's doing. I think that's a statement of success, where a person can let it go and say the only person that's judging me is the one I'm following. And so to Paul, and here is, we had already read from Galatians, but I find this to be so helpful. Back in Galatians 2:20, he said, I am crucified with Christ. And then in 5:24 of Galatians, those who are Christ's have crucified their own flesh. In other words, if you are crucified with Christ, you are going to thus treat others as though you are crucified. You have let go of your ambitions, and so that you can understand that the standard of what Christ is looking for is simple faithfulness to those around you. In Paul's case, it would be the individual believer in Corinth. And as we continue to read through Corinthians, let's watch how that comes to the fore in much of his teaching.